Hey everyone, I wanted to do a quick Puritan review. Some of this information may be new to you, so feel free to write down any of that information in your notes. So the first question we need to ask is, why did the Puritans leave England? The Puritans left England because they believed that the Anglican Church of England had become too garish and idolatrous in its worship. There was some concern that it was becoming too much like the Roman Catholic Church, and so the Puritans wanted to return to their Calvinist roots. And so they decided to leave. The picture on the screen is a recreation of what a Puritan church might have looked like. You can see this, the pews are sectioned off. Men and women did not sit next to one another, and the benches were very hard, and this was a frequent place to attend, not just on Sundays, but also during the week. The Puritans saw their lives as a divine mission. God gave them the new world because they were his chosen people. And this idea is the precursor to the concept of manifest destiny, which basically was a 19th century doctrine or belief that the expansion of the United States throughout the American continent was both justified and inevitable. The Puritan life stressed self-discipline and introspection. We talked a little earlier about the Puritan beliefs. They believed in predestination. They believed that salvation or damnation was predetermined by God. They believed in original sin. Humans are born evil, and good can only be accomplished through hard work and self-discipline. They believed in providence, that God rewarded and or punished behaviors, as well as grace. They believed that grace was a gift from God and only a few select people experienced this. The Puritans believed the Bible to be the supreme authority on earth and used the Bible to justify their occupation of the land and their use of force against Native Americans. The question at the top of the screen, am I one of the elect, is a question that frequently Puritans asked themselves. They examined themselves, they examined their lives, they watched one another, and they believed that guilt and remorse were signs of God's grace, as well as thrift, industry, hard work, and success. So hard work was considered a religious duty, and emphasis again was laid on that constant self-examination and self-discipline. And if the Puritans were not at work, they were likely at church or at prayer. And it's this morally oppressive atmosphere that historians argue led to the girls of Salem maybe taking advantage of the power that they gained from accusing the elders who previously controlled them. So failure to observe the Sabbath day, blasphemy, so inappropriate language, fornication, drunkenness, gambling, participation in theatrical performances were all punishable offenses. And the Puritans did not shy away from punishment. They had a variety of punishments. These varied depending on the quote-unquote crime. Wearing a sign, making use of pillories, stocks, whipping, branding, using the dunking stool, and even execution. This is an example of someone having to wear a sign. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a story called The Scarlet Letter, which is about a woman who is accused of adultery, and she has to wear a scarlet A on all of her clothing for her entire life. So they set time limits on this as well. Okay, the picture on the left is a picture of a stockade. This was generally reserved for people in the lower classes, and you can see that their hands and feet were contained. Crowds would gather to laugh, jeer, spit, throw food at the people being punished. The picture on the right is an example of a pillory. This was usually reserved for people who were higher class. Again, crowds would gather to jeer, laugh, throw food, that sort of thing. Whipping. Whipping was reserved for men only. Branding, it depended on the crime. So you could be branded with a letter, like T for being a thief, D for drunkenness, A for adultery. And the dunking stool was reserved for women. Again, crowds would gather. It was all very public. The Puritans were highly literate people. They believed in education. They believed in learning how to read. And education was a way to fight atheism. They didn't have, obviously they read the Bible. That was like the most important book to read. They did have other books, but all of their writing was very religious in nature. They wrote narratives, journals, biographies, hymns, sermons. They believed that writing history was important. The first printing press was brought to the colonies in 1638. Obviously, again, the Bible was important. There was also a very popular poem called Day of Doom by Michael Wigglesworth. It was about the ending of the world. Very cheerful topic. In 1636, the Puritans founded Harvard, the first college in America. And there were people who did not exactly fit in. So people like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, they were excommunicated. So you could be excommunicated, kicked out of the church, and driven out of the community. Roger Williams was banished. We talked about him. He was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony for challenging the strict religious code and the government's right to confiscate Native American land without compensation. Quakers and other dissenters received very harsh punishments, again including execution for their beliefs. So the Puritans were very much, our way or the highway, so to speak. They honored material success, as I mentioned before. They valued family life, community, service, art, and literature. They were known to drink beer and other alcoholic beverages on occasion, but again, not to excess. By 1700, the Puritans, their way of life was really in decline for various reasons. The first would be the Indian Wars that were happening. We talked a little bit about King Philip's War and that atrocities were committed on both sides. There was also urbanization. More non-Puritans were joining the colonies. There was the Age of Reason, so religion was being attacked, and the focus was placed on science and reason. And then, of course, we have the Salem witch trials. However, after the 17th century, Puritan attitudes and ethics really continued to exert an influence on American society, even after the Puritans as a political entity really disappeared. They made a virtue of qualities that made for economic success. So self-reliance, frugality, self-discipline, industry. Their, again, concern for education was important in the development of the United States, and the idea of congregational democratic church government was carried into the political life of the state as a source of modern democracy. So we're moving into the witchcraft trials. Now, 44 years before the Salem witchcraft trials, in 1648, Margaret Jones was found guilty of being a witch and hanged. And among her charges were that she had a malignant touch, which caused many persons to be taken with deafness or vomiting or other violent pains or sickness. That she practiced medicine and prescribed remedies that should have been harmless but actually produced violent effects. that she put a curse on people who would not use her medicines, that she foretold the future, and that a supernatural child appeared and disappeared in her prison cell. And so some of these same things we see in the Salem witchcraft trials. Okay, so in the 1690s, several Puritan girls accused a servant, Tituba, of being a witch. Tituba was originally from Barbados, and to protect herself, Tituba implicates other members of the community. And this starts a chain reaction. 27 people are convicted of practicing witchcraft. 50 others, quote unquote, confess, and 100 others are imprisoned and await trial. In the end, 19 people and 2 dogs are executed for being witches. So again, since the Puritans were living by like this rigid moral code, they believed that all sins from sleeping in church to stealing food should be punished. Okay, and so they also believed God would punish, again, that sinful behavior, that it was, again, referring to that providence. So when a neighbor would suffer a misfortune, such as a sick child or a failed crop, Puritans saw it as God's will, and they didn't help. They believed the devil was as real as God, and everyone was faced with the struggle between the powers of good and evil. But they believed that Satan would select the weakest individuals, like women, children, the insane, and carry out his work. The Puritan men believed that they were the stronger sex. So they, again, it was very, very gender role community. The women worked in the house, the men worked in the fields. Those who followed Satan or claimed they did or were accused of it, they called witches. And witchcraft was one of the greatest crimes a person could commit, punishable by death. So fear of magic and witchcraft was common in New England as it had been in Europe. Over 100 alleged witches had been tried and hanged in New England during the 1600s, but the hangings in 1692 in Salem would be the last ones in America. So they had tests to determine whether someone was a witch or not. Church officials sometimes poked suspects with pins, searching for a so-called devil's mark, a spot where no pain was felt. And it was believed that this spot was where Satan sealed his pact with the person. And, you know, thinking about this time period, lots of vermin, and these spots were common, okay? If a person was poked with something sharp and the suspect didn't bleed or it didn't hurt, they were considered a witch. And English, quote, experts believe witches often had extra nipples that they used to suckle demons. So they would search a person's body for any of these marks. Another test involved tying together the hands and feet of the accused and throwing him or her into water. Those who floated were declared witches. Those who drowned were declared innocent. They would weigh a suspect against a very heavy Bible. And if you weigh less than the Bible, you're a witch. They would also ask the person to recite the Lord's Prayer without making a mistake. And one of the most popular questions to ask a suspect was, how long have you been a witch? Assuming their guilt. In the Salem witch trials, spectral evidence was admitted. So it was the testimony of a church member who claimed to have seen a person's spirit performing witchcraft, and that was enough to sentence someone to death. So I just included a picture from Lord of the Rings of the specters, right? So we're going to be reading the Crucible, okay? And one theory is that it wasn't necessarily the girls faking, but perhaps their food supply had been contaminated and they were hallucinating. So that's something else to consider. This story is an allegory, okay? And it was a witch hunt in the 50s, and Arthur Miller was accused of being a communist. So he wrote this story to try to reflect what was happening in the 1950s. So please keep that in mind. We are not teaching witchcraft, Okay?